Introduce our speaker today. So our speaker is Jeremy Fox, who comes to us from University of Calgary, where he's in the biology department there. He's been there for many years. I actually first met Jeremy. I met him when I was a graduate student at ESA. He doesn't remember meeting me, which is fine because that's what happens. And then I was introduced to the dynamic ecology blog post, which has since helped me get a job and has also helped me navigate many other aspects of academics. So if you're not familiar with the blog, you should definitely read it. I think it's a huge contribution to the science community in general. And also, having said that, a lot of Jeremy's research has been quite fantastic and influential, and that's why he's here to give a talk today. Okay, so without further ado, welcome Jeremy.
Everyone hear me? Thank you all for coming, everyone both who's here and who's joining us online. Thank you to Chris for the kind invitation. This is a rare treat for me. Between the pandemic and frankly me just getting old, I don't get invited to give seminars much anymore. It used to be a thing I got to do, and then at some point it stopped. So this is a rare opportunity to go someplace new and meet new people, hear about the interesting science that they're doing. It's great. And so in this talk, right, it's my job to return the favor and tell you about some of the interesting science that I've been doing. So I'm going to tell you about some brand new work today. This is work that's not published yet. And the project's still, frankly, at a quite early stage where it would still benefit from feedback. And so I'm really looking forward to the questions afterwards. So the work I'm going to talk about today actually was my idea originally, but it quickly got to the point where I needed to do some actual math. And so I roped in an actual mathematician. So Nick Cortezas at Wake Forest is my unindicted co-conspirator. And I've really enjoyed working with him on this, not just because he can do more math than I can, but also because he brings a different perspective to the problem and has helped me kind of see the problem with fresh eyes. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, actually. Nick should be here online. He was kind enough to say he was going to join us today. And so afterwards, perhaps if there are questions, maybe Nick and I will be able to work together to answer them. So it's going to be a slightly unconventional structure of the talk. And let me sort of explain the method to the madness here. This talk is kind of a good illustration of how I do science. Different people get their scientific ideas in different ways. As an ecologist, the way I get my ideas is often by thinking about stuff that's not ecology and then making an analogy to ecology. And so on a good day, that works well. Grabbing ideas from other domains and applying them to ecology can be kind of a shortcut to ecological insight. But then on a bad day, it's like the pointy haired boss in this cartoon, I get arrested by the analogy police. So hopefully I was having a good day analogy-wise when I dreamed up this project, but you'll have to be the judge of that. So I'm going to start a little unconventionally, is the point here. All right. I'm going to start by talking about something that's not ecology and then talk about how it applies to ecology. So indulge me for a few minutes while we talk about not ecology. All right. So let's talk about gambling for resurrection. So this term comes from a book of theoretical political science. It is called Optimal Imperfection. It's by George Downes and David Rock, and it came out in 1995. So this book uses stochastic optimization theory to understand the decision-making of domestic political leaders under conditions of uncertainty and asks about the consequences of that for international relations. So one of the key results concerns the incentives that are faced by a domestic political leader who is in imminent danger of losing office, say because of some scandal. Right? Under certain circumstances, Downes and Rock show that a leader in that situation actually has a strong incentive to start a war. Now, this is obviously an incredibly risky thing to do. For starters, you might lose the war. But if you're a political leader who's in imminent danger of losing office and you don't want that to happen, you want to remain in office, well, one thing about starting a war is that it does tend to cause the populace to rally around the flag. big, as the saying goes. It does cause people to rally behind the domestic political leader. And if you win the war, that does tend to be politically popular. And so in theory, one option, if you're a domestic political leader faced with imminent loss of office, is to start a war. Downes and Rock termed this gambling for resurrection. Okay. So the idea here is that the leader is taking a very risky gamble in order to resurrect their domestic political fortunes. Okay. Let's see what's going on here. Come on. Okay, there we go. So this book became famous, at least for political science values of famous, and that was because it had absolutely perfect timing. So just 2 years after this book came out, in a complete coincidence, the movie Wag the Dog came out. Does anyone in this room remember this movie? I saw this movie. A couple of people here saw this movie. So for those of you, the many of you who didn't see this, in Wag the Dog, Robert De Niro here plays a U.S. president who is caught up in a sex scandal. And so he hires a Hollywood director and political spin doctor, played by Dustin Hoffman there, to fake a war with Albania, to distract the public from the sex scandal and unite them behind President De Niro so that he can stay in office. And now it gets better, because just months after this movie came out, U.S. President Bill Clinton, who at the time was about to be impeached for a sex scandal, initiated bombing campaigns in a couple of places, actually, in Afghanistan and also the Sudan. And Clinton was accused of wagging the dog, or as, like in this LA Times headline, or as Downes and Rock would have put it, he was accused of gambling for resurrection. He was accused of starting a risky war in order to resurrect his domestic political fortunes. But of course, the idea of gambling for resurrection actually has plenty of analogs outside of politics, right? So for instance, hockey teams that are trailing late in the game, of course, often will replace the goalie with an extra skater. So you can see there's no goalie in this picture, just the team's goal, right? The goal's empty because the goalie has been replaced. This is a risky move. It increases the odds that you will lose by more than you are currently losing. All right. But here's the thing, right? Hockey teams don't ordinarily care about their margin of victory or loss. All they care about is winning, or at least not losing. And so if you're about to lose the game, unless we score, we're going to lose. Well, you might as well go all out to score. You might as well trade some risk of giving up an additional goal for an increased chance, however small, of scoring one yourself, right? This comes up in a lot of different sports. This is the idea behind Hail Mary passes in football, right? It's the reason why NBA teams, they're trailing late in the game, will intentionally foul the opposition. That increases free throws are usually easy to make, so that increases the amount by which you expect to lose the game on average, but it's a risk worth taking because it does give you some chance that the other team will miss a lot of free throws and thereby let you get back into the game, right? Shows up in poker as well. There's actually a actual peer-reviewed paper on this. Experienced poker players who are down to a small stack of chips and facing an opponent with a much larger stack will start to take bigger risks. They'll do things like bluff with a bad hand. And the reason for doing that is in poker, if you have a small stack of chips and your opponent has a large stack, you're pretty much guaranteed to lose eventually, right? And your only hope of getting back into it is to take some risks that wouldn't ordinarily be a good idea, so trade some risk of losing quickly for the sake of some chance of not losing. And this shows up in ecology and evolution as well. So for instance, some organisms, such as the Daphnia, the water fleas pictured here, will engage in condition-dependent sexual reproduction. So organisms that engage in condition-dependent sex only have sex when they're in bad shape. So Daphnia, for instance, or if you don't know, they're zooplankton. They live in temperate lakes. They eat algae. And for most of the growing season, they reproduce asexually. So they're females. They're all females. And the females just clone themselves and just keep doing that. But at the early in the fall, their algal food starts to get scarce. And at that point, the Daphnia will produce males who then mate with the females, and the resulting sexual eggs overwinter in the sediment and then hatch the following spring. Sexual reproduction is, of course, a genetic risk. You're breaking up favorable combinations of alleles, and you're shuffling genes onto new genetic backgrounds, right? But if you're in bad condition, it's a risk worth taking, right? If your current genotype isn't hacking it and has low fitness, well, you might as well roll the genetic dice and see if you can give your offspring a better, luck your offspring into a better genotype, right? Other examples of this, it's been shown experimentally that poor environments actually select for higher rates of mutation and recombination. Think about mutation, for instance. This is work from Graham Bell and others. Most mutations are deleterious, right? On average, mutations are bad. But if you're in a very bad environment, very stressful, an environment to which you're very poorly adapted, so your fitness in this environment is low, well, how much worse can things get, right? How much worse could the mutations make things for your offspring? Your phenotype already sucks. Okay, so you might as well like roll the genetic dice and have lots of mutant offspring in the hopes that some of those mutants will be beneficial. Shows up in behavioral ecology, same idea. Lizards, for instance, like this South Indian rockagama, have been shown to forage in riskier ways when they're starving. They will, for instance, forage in food-rich areas that have a high risk of predation. Right. Rockagamas also actually will, in the lab, if they're starving, they will prefer a high variance amount of food to the certainty of a small amount of food. Because if you're starving, the only way to survive is to get a lot of food quickly. And so the certainty of getting a small amount of food doesn't actually help you. Right. So, the point of all these examples is that if you're doomed unless something changes, change is good. Bad risks become good. Variance is good for you. That's the idea of gambling for resurrection. Okay. And now, importantly, this is still true even if you're not the one deciding what risks to take. It's still true even if the risks are something that just happens to you. So that brings us to my research. So thank you for indulging me there for a few minutes. So now let's talk about environmental stochasticity and population extinction risk. So by environmental stochasticity, I just mean stochastic fluctuations over time in abiotic environmental conditions that affect the birth and death rates of the organisms in the population. So for instance, this at the top here, this is just a time series of mean annual temperature in Calgary, where I live over the last 75 years. And then down at the bottom here, this is just a chart of daily high and low temperature. Oh, sorry, this is mean annual rainfall at the top. Sorry, my bad. That's rainfall at the top. Temperatures at the bottom. This is just daily high and low temperatures over the last 6 months down here. I just put these up to remind you that the environment fluctuates on all time scales. And those fluctuations have consequences for the birth and death rates of the organisms. And because they have consequences for organisms' birth and death rates, they have consequences for population persistence and extinction. And those consequences have been well studied theoretically, and the consensus is that they're bad, that environmental stochasticity is bad for population persistence. Now, in a minute, I'm going to try to convince you that that consensus is missing something. But to do that, I first have to explain to you what the consensus is and why it exists. So let's talk about the consensus view for a minute. The core intuition goes back at least as far as Lewontin and Cohen, 1969 in PNAS, a classic paper. So they studied a very simple model of a population exhibiting density-independent geometric growth and subjected to normally distributed random variation over time in the per capita growth rate. So the per capita growth rate varies from one time step to the next. And the per capita growth rate, so the population growth rate is denoted lambda here. And what you find is that this is the crucial equation. The higher the variance in lambda, so that's this parameter here, the more that environmental stochasticity, that's whatever it is that's making lambda vary. That's what we're calling environmental stochasticity. The greater the variance in lambda, the more you end up subtracting off from the expected population growth rate compared to what the growth rate would be in a constant environment in which lambda just remained at its average value all the time, right? So this result happens basically because population growth is multiplicative. Right. So, for instance, if the population goes up by 10% in one time step and then goes down by 10% in the next time step, it ends up a bit smaller than it was at the beginning, right? Because you've taken 10 plus 10% of a smaller number, and now you're going to take minus 10% of a bigger number, right? And so the order in which you do those two things doesn't matter. You end up in the same place, right? So fluctuations in lambda are bad. Lewontin and Cohen in their paper emphasized the possibility that a population that would just grow forever in a constant environment can actually be guaranteed to go extinct in a fluctuating environment because of this effect. And subsequently, many people have looked at other models, and that broad conclusion still holds. Environmental stochasticity increases extinction risk, in part for the reasons that Lewontin and Cohen studied. It also increases extinction risk because it creates the risk of catastrophes. There might be some really bad environment all of a sudden that just basically wipes the entire population out instantly. Right? It's thought that autocorrelated environments are especially bad. So if you don't know that term, by an autocorrelated environment, we just mean an environment in which like tomorrow's conditions tend to be similar to today's. Real environments all are positively autocorrelated, right? And that's bad because it creates the chance of a run of many consecutive time periods of bad environmental conditions. And the only exceptions to these generalizations that are known, there are some exceptions, and they basically all have to do with cases in which the population's response to the environment has just the right sort of nonlinear shape. So for instance, in this simple example I've drawn here, we're imagining the per capita growth rate is this concave up function of some environmental variable. So now if the environment were to fluctuate, that would actually be good for the population, because like fluctuations above the average would really boost the growth rate a lot, whereas fluctuations below the average wouldn't reduce it that much. So you see what I mean, right? So that's the exception to the general picture. That's the known exception to the general picture that I've shown you here. And so that's the theory, and there is at least some empirical support for it as well. I'm really an empirical ecologist at heart. I just kind of play a mathematician, on TV sometimes. So I'm going to show you some data. This is work from Sather et al. 1998 on a population of great tits, so birds that live in Witham Wood in the UK. And this is a time series of their abundance over time. And Sather et al. Fit a density-dependent stochastic population model to these time series data. One of the parameters that you estimate from that model is a parameter that captures the estimated effect of environmental stochasticity on the bird's population growth rate. And so this is a graph of the implications of that estimate. So on the y-axis here, we've got on the log scale, the estimated time to extinction. How long would you expect to wait before this population went extinct as a function of its mean population growth rate at low density? And this line here, this is the relationship you'd expect between those variables at the estimated level of environmental stochasticity, so the estimated environmental variance and the population growth rate. If you were to, say, dial down the environmental variance, that's this dotted line up here. So if you dial down the environmental variance, make it less variable, the population is expected to last longer at any given level, any given population growth rate. Conversely, if you were to make the environment even more variable, you shift this down and you don't expect the population to last as long. Yeah. But these are, of course, they're just estimates from observational data. We'd like to be able to validate them if we could. To do that, we need to turn to experimental studies on organisms with faster generation times, where we can set up a lot of experimental populations, then follow them until they go extinct. And so the best experiments along these lines are probably from John Drake's lab, and he used populations of Daphnia magna, zooplankton, growing in beakers in the lab. And the way these experiments work is you can either feed the Daphnia a constant amount of food every day, or you can feed them an amount of food that varies randomly from one day to the next, but with the same mean as in the constant treatment. So you can impose environmental stochasticity in their food supply rate. And when you do this, you don't always see exactly what you'd expect. So these are results from one experiment from John Drake's group. In this experiment, there were 3 levels of environmental variability, low, medium, or high. And these are just histograms of the log transformed days to extinction, time to extinction for these populations. And you can see those 3 histograms don't look all that different from one another. I mean, if anything, actually, it's most common for populations to last a really long time in the treatment with the highest environmental variance. So what's up with that? Here's another experiment from John Drake's group. This is Robinson all 2013. Let me walk you through this because it's kind of an ugly graph. This is an experiment where we just have 2 treatments, either a constant environment or a variable environment. Okay. And the way it's presented here on the y-axis, we've just got the proportion of populations surviving as a function of the day of the experiment. And so this is just a survival curve for the populations. This experiment was run twice, repeated twice. So the first repetition of the experiment is the solid lines. And in that first run of the experiment, it worked the way you'd expect. So the bold solid line here, that's the survival curve for the populations that were subjected to environmental variability. The thin solid line is the populations that were given a constant environment in terms of their food supply. And so the solid line, they went extinct faster, right? So that's what you'd expect. The variability increased the daily probability of extinction. But then they did the experiment again, and it worked the opposite way. So now if you look at the dashed lines, the bold dashed line here is above the thin dashed line. So when they ran it again, environmental variability actually reduced the extinction risk, at least beyond about like day 25 or so. Now, John Drake and his group have suggested various explanations for these kind of surprising results. And I want to emphasize, for all I know, those explanations are right. However, what I'm going to do today is suggest what is, as far as I know, a novel explanation for seemingly anomalous results like this. I'm going to suggest that these are actually examples of gambling for resurrection. What you're seeing here is that in some circumstances, environmental stochasticity actually does reduce extinction risk in the short term and increases your chances of persisting for the long term. And specifically, those circumstances are when your background extinction risk is high. If the population would ordinarily probably be doomed in the absence of stochasticity, that's when stochasticity could actually help you. A gambling for resurrection effect. So in the time remaining, I'll tell you about some tests of that idea. That environmental stochasticity is actually good for populations if they are already at high background risk of extinction. So I'll first tell you about 2 different theoretical models of different ecological scenarios. And then I'll tell you about an experiment with Daphnia that's very much like the experiments John Drake's group has done, except with one crucial twist. I also varied background extinction risk with the expectation that that should change the effect of environmental stochasticity. So here's the first model. It's a math bio talk. I should show you an equation. But I'm embarrassed to be showing you like literally the simplest equation in like all of mathematical biology. Like, look, you paid to fly me all this way. So I could show you the equation for exponential growth. Here's the analytical solution to exponential growth. Okay. So actually, I should say exponential decline. Okay. So first, we're going to consider a population that is declining exponentially. Okay, and this is in contrast to previous work, which considers populations that grow in the absence of environmental stochasticity. So we're going to consider a declining population, and we're going to declare this population extinct once it drops below some threshold abundance. And we're going to add in environmental stochasticity by allowing the per capita growth rate to vary as a first order autoregressive process that's normally distributed with some constant variance. So if you know what that means, all that means is like the per capita growth rate over time is going to vary because we're basically effectively drawing numbers from a normal distribution with some standard deviation. And then the next number we draw is going to have some positive correlation with the previous number we drew. And so those correlations, of course, implement autocorrelation. So the higher the correlation is, the greater the tendency for conditions in the next time period to be similar to today's conditions. All right. So the nice thing about this model is that it's analytically tractable. So if you plot abundance over time on a log scale, so we got log transformed abundance on the y-axis over time here. The deterministic case with no environmental stochasticity is this black line. So in this example, we just started with 10 individuals and we pick parameters such that the population drops and hits the extinction threshold at time 40. Okay. So that's the black line. That's the deterministic case. With stochasticity, you get all these blue lines, right? You get a distribution of outcomes, and you can actually come up with a formula. You can solve analytically for the distribution of abundances in any time t. It turns out to be log normal. So it's normally distributed on a log scale, right? So that's what this normal distribution is here. And so you can work out a formula, an analytical formula for okay, at any time t, what is the probability that the population is still above the extinction threshold, right? And so it's that chunk of the distribution, right? This is more math than I can do, but it was straightforward for Nick, apparently. So Nick did the math here and drew this pretty graph, and also these pretty graphs. So here's what you find. So here's a case in which, the type's too small here. Here's a case in which in a deterministic world, so no stochasticity, the population would go extinct at time 20. What we're showing here now is, on the y-axis, is the probability that the population lasts until at least time 40. Okay, so twice as long as it would last in a deterministic world. Okay, we're showing that probability as a function of two things. One, on the x-axis here is the variance in per capita growth rate. So that's environmental stochasticity. Again, we're not specifying the environmental variable. We're just saying there is one, and it makes the per capita growth rate vary. And we're also showing the level of autocorrelation here as different colored lines. So darker lines indicate more autocorrelation. So now you can see the gambling for resurrection effect. So as you go from left to right, the lines go up. So if you add more and more environmental stochasticity, the population's chances of lasting until time 40 go up and up. And as you add more autocorrelation, so as you go from the lightest colored lines to the darkest ones, again, they're going up. Because if you make the environment autocorrelated, you have a greater and greater chance of a run of good conditions that lets the population last for a long time. So all of the results on this graph are actually the reverse of the conventional wisdom. Now, we recover the conventional wisdom if we make the population less extinction prone, if we let it last longer in the absence of environmental stochasticity. So now here's a graph of here's a case where the population would last until time 40 in the absence of stochasticity. And so now if we add in stochasticity, it's always got a 50-50 chance in a stochastic world of lasting until time 40, right? Because that's the mean of the distribution. That it doesn't matter how variable the environment is or how autocorrelated it is. And if we now so now in a deterministic world, the population would last until time 60. So now if we ask, well, what are your odds of lasting until time 40? Well, of course, they go down as you make things more and more stochastic, and as you make the environment more and more autocorrelated. So this is the conventional result. So the intuition here is really very simple, right? Environmental stochasticity is its variance, right? So it increases the chances of both extremely bad outcomes and extremely good outcomes. And just what we're emphasizing here is that, well, if you're in a situation where you're gonna go extinct soon, the bad outcomes maybe don't matter so much because like they're not really that much worse than what was going to happen anyway, right? Whereas the good outcomes might, for instance, buy you time for something else good to happen. And so you can put a pin in that. That's something I'll actually come back to at the end of the talk. Okay. So our second model considers a different ecological scenario. So here the population exhibits density-dependent growth in the absence of environmental stochasticity. So it's not inevitably doomed to extinction after some fixed period of time, but it is still subject to extinction risk, and that's thanks to demographic stochasticity. Demographic stochasticity just means good luck and bad luck that happen to individual organisms independently of one another. Okay, so rather than their births and deaths being deterministic, they're a matter of random chance that happens independently to each individual. And so each time step, each individual gives birth to some Poisson distributed number of offspring, and the mean of that Poisson distribution is density dependent, so it goes down as density goes up, and there's of course a minimum of 0 because you can't have negative births. And because these random draws from our Poisson distribution are happening independently for all the organisms in the population, the sum of a bunch of Poissons is a Poisson, and so this whole thing ends up being Poisson. And then individuals who are alive at the start of the time step have some chance S of surviving, otherwise they die. And so the number of survivors is just a binomially distributed random variable, and that bit is density independent. And then we can add in environmental stochasticity to this in the same, similar way to the previous model. We're just going to make the y-intercept of the birth rate. So the mean birth rate at low density is now going to be, again, a first order autoregressive process normally distributed with some standard deviation. And because we're not changing the slope, effectively what this means is if the carrying capacity, if you like, the expected density conditional on not going extinct is also going to fluctuate over time. So the x-intercept is going to fluctuate over time too. And so you can't solve this model analytically, so you have to simulate it. So here's just 100 simulations of the same parameter values, all starting with one individual initially. And hopefully what you can see is a lot of these populations go extinct very early on, but some of them do last beyond that, and if they do, their extinction risk per unit time then goes down because they get a little more abundant, and so demographic stochasticity is less likely to wipe them out. But there is still some extinction risk. So extinction risk is especially high early on. Is the point here? Okay. So here are some graphs summarizing the results of a bunch of simulations. So on the y-axis of each of these graphs is the proportion of populations that persisted at least 10 time steps. Okay. On the x-axis of each graph is environmental variability, so the standard deviation of our environmental variance parameter. So no variability up to the highest level. The different colors are different levels of autocorrelation. So again, darker colors are more autocorrelated. And then the three panels are like bad environment, so low density birth rate is quite low. Good environment, low density birth rate is higher, and then the middle panel is somewhere in the middle. Okay. So if we look at this panel first, so crappy environment, you can see the background extinction risk is quite high. So for these parameters, so even in the absence of any environmental stochasticity, less than 10% of the populations persist for even 10 time steps with this SAP, right? Because they started very small, right? But if you make the environment quite variable and it's quite autocorrelated, your odds of persisting at least 10 time steps go way up. So there's your gambling for resurrection effect. Right? Things couldn't get much worse, so environmental stochasticity made them better. However, you recover the traditional sort of consensus results as you make the environment better on average. So as you go from the middle panel to the right panel, the background extinction risk drops, right? And so once you make the environment sufficiently good, adding an environmental stochasticity is bad for population persistence, even if whether it's autocorrelated or not. So you recover the consensus result. Okay, so that was the theory. But as I said, I'm not really a proper theoretician. I'm really an experimentalist at heart. And so I wanted to do an experiment. So last winter, I had the students in my population ecology class, all 4 of them, do an experiment as a class exercise. So as in John Drake's work, we had populations of Daphnia, Daphnia magna, zooplankton. We use that particular Daphnia species, by the way, because this is what everybody uses, because it's very sort of tolerant of like water quality issues and stuff. Like you could literally grow it in toilet water, like it'd be fine. So it didn't really matter what kind of water we had, it'll grow. So we have them in beakers in the lab. We're feeding them yeast 3 times a week. The experiment was a 2x2 factorial design. So we crossed constant or variable food supply with 2 levels of background extinction risk, low or high. And that was manipulated by manipulating the size of the beakers and the amount of food they're provided on average. Right? So if you have them in small beakers and don't provide much food on average, well, that imposes a higher background risk of extinction, regardless of whether we're making the food supply fluctuate or not. Yeah. And just an important wrinkle in the design you should know about, within each of the variable food treatments, there were actually 5 different random sequences of the same food amounts. And the reason why we're doing that is so that you don't confound variability in food supply with the effects of a particular sequence of different food amounts. You want to make sure you're isolating the effect of variance per se. And so you need to have a bunch of different sequences. All right. And these populations were initially small, 3 to 7 individuals, and and the presence absence was monitored for 25 days on weekdays. As you'll see, that turns out to be long enough to get results in this case. And there were 50 replicate populations per treatment, so 200 in total. Every ecologist has pretty pictures of their field site in their talk. Here are mine. This is a teaching lab in our biology building. This is the 4 undergraduates in the class. Along with it, we had some assistants from our department's ecology technician, Luis Hahn, and here we are. All our I did my bit too when I wasn't taking these pictures. I was also helping. Okay, we were all pipetting Daphnia into beakers. So here results. So these are Kaplan-Meier survival curves. They've got 95% confidence intervals, and they're showing you the probability of population survival up to any given day of the experiment. And there are 4 lines of different colors, 1 for each of the 4 treatments. And I also did fit Cox proportional hazards models to test for treatment effects on daily extinction hazard in these populations. So basically the daily probability of going extinct. But I'm not going to show you the stats because frankly, the results are visually obvious. So the key thing to see here is that survival probability was quite high in the treatment with a constant environment and low background extinction risks. That's the sort of reddish pink line here. And it was lower, so scenario probability was much lower in the other three treatments, which were all statistically indistinguishable from one another. Okay. So what that means is that if you have a constant environment with low background extinction risk, and then you add an environmental stochasticity, you jack the daily extinction hazard way up. They have much greater chance per day of going extinct, so they don't survive as well. But, I mean, these lines are all kind of on top of one another, so it's hard to see. But if you have a constant environment with high background extinction risk, and then you add an environmental stochasticity, the daily odds of extinction actually don't change. Now, they didn't actually reverse, okay? But directionally, the effect is, at least qualitatively, in the direction you would expect if this gambling for resurrection effect is operating. There were also, I won't show it here, if folks want to ask me afterwards, I can talk about it. There were also some interesting differences in results between different sequences of feeding that I could talk about later. So in conclusion then, high background extinction risk reverses the effects of environmental stochasticity on populations. It reverses all the standard results. So, if you're already at high risk of extinction, well, turn that frown upside down, because environmental stochasticity, odds are, is going to help you, because it doesn't have much scope to make things worse. All right. Variance is good for you when you're already doomed. So I'll leave you with a few final thoughts here. One is this, in both of the models and experiment that I've shown you, extinction is pretty much inevitable in the long run. And so that raises the question of whether gambling for resurrection is really actually resurrecting anything, or whether it's just kind of delaying the inevitable. And I have a two-part kind of response to that. So first, real-world conservation management often seeks to improve the odds that some threatened population or species will persist for, say, 50 years or something like that, right? As economist John Maynard Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead, okay? But yet, we still care about things that happen in the shorter run or the medium term, and rightly so. Okay, so that's one part of my answer. The other part of the answer is that it's possible that gambling for resurrection effect might buy time for other things about the system to change that produce a more permanent reduction in extinction risk. And that's actually already been shown theoretically. So these are, I won't walk you through this, but these are theoretical results from Peniston et al. 2020. So they studied a model in which they're imagining that, there's been some sudden environmental change for the worst, and so the population is now currently very poorly adapted to the environment now that it's changed, and the population is going to go extinct unless it adapts, unless it evolves, right? And it turns out that in those circumstances, if the environmental change is really bad, such that it would drive the population to extinction very fast, environmental stochasticity actually improves the odds of what's known as evolutionary rescue, because it creates some chance of, you get a run of good conditions, and that buys the population time to evolve in such a way such that, my fitness in this environment is no longer less than 1, I can now increase, right? So this gambling for resurrection effect might work in combination with other effects to affect population persistence. The second thing that I've been thinking about, this is kind of a vague thought. I've been wondering about the transition between the traditional picture and the new one I've just introduced. Because on the one hand, the traditional picture says, environmental stochasticity, that's bad. That reduces population size N, which thereby increases extinction risk. Well, except that then when N gets low, environmental stochasticity becomes good for you, right? So I've been thinking about the push and pull between these two, ways of thinking about the problem. That's kind of a vague thought, but I need to sort of think more about that and how it affects the actual realized, pathway to extinction that you might observe. A third thought, and this is something Nick's been nudging me to think more about. I mentioned that previous theory has identified other cases in which environmental stochasticity is good for population persistence. They're basic cases like this, I said, where you've got the right nonlinear relationship between some environmental variable and some measure of population growth rate or performance, right? And I start out contrasting gambling for resurrection with this sort of picture. But Nick's been nudging me to think more about it because I'm no longer so sure that maybe there really is a contrast, because I started out thinking there was, because like, oh, well, I'm not even explicitly specifying the environmental variable at all here, right? Like this, what I'm studying is just not this. But maybe there's a sense in which what I'm studying is this, because the idea from gambling resurrection is that, well, your downside risk is capped, right? Whereas, oh, if you get lucky, the environment might actually, fluctuate in a way that gives you a lot of upside. And so if you kind of squint at what I've been doing, it actually does kind of look like this sort of situation. So anyway, here's a silly meme. There's a picture of me thinking about, well, is gambling for resurrection, is this actually just nonlinear responses to the environment kind of in disguise? Something I'm thinking about. Okay. So to wrap things up here, one more final thought. If you like this talk, and frankly, even if you didn't, you should buy my book. All right. So it's a great book. It comes out on Christmas. Yes, really. It actually comes out on Christmas Day if you look on Amazon. It's called The Ecology of Ecologists. And it's about how the field of ecology as a whole can better harness the diverse ideas and approaches and goals of its practitioners, so the field as a whole progresses as fast as possible and is more than just the sum of its parts, right? There are lots of ecologists in the world, right? Studying all sorts of different questions in all sorts of different places in all sorts of different ways. How do we make the most of all that stuff? How do we most effectively learn from each other? I've written a book about that. I'm very proud of it. It argues that you can learn from nature how to study nature. So it's a book full of analogies. So you read it, you'll hear about a lot of interesting examples of ecology, and then get to think about, oh, if you think about it in the right way, here's how ecologists can kind of emulate this thing that nature's doing. So it's super fun. You should all teach like graduate seminars this book and buy like several copies for the ecologist in your life. It's a perfect gift. So I'll leave you with that. Thanks for listening. Happy to take questions. Nick is in? Okay, good. Okay, good. So Nick is here. You can ask math questions of Nick. I'm to blame for anything too ridiculous. And so what is the best way? Because the way it's set up at the moment, I don't see anyone who's online. And so I don't know how that's been handled in the past in terms of taking questions.
Actually, we get them to unmute usually.
Okay.
And if not,
and I'll hear it. Okay.
I should hear it. Yeah.
All right. Okay. But I see we do have a question here to start. Yeah.
Thanks for the really nice talk. In your graph, the variant B0, like you have B0.8, B01, and
yeah.
B0.2. In the middle one, I remember that it's
yeah. Wait. This one?
Sorry, no. I was thinking about a different one where you had this cutoff regime with a 50%.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So
in the left and right graphs, when they saturate, they don't quite reach 0.5. Is it obvious that if I take P to 1, that those saturation values go to 0.5, or is there always going to be a gap?
So they wouldn't go exactly to 0.5 because remember here, like we're looking at odds of persisting until time 40 in a population that in a deterministic world would go extinct at time 20, right? Or here it's like persisting to time 40 in a world where in the deterministic case you'd go until time 60, right? So I don't think maybe Nick will correct me on this. I don't think that these curves would be expected to asymptote at 0.5. I don't think, but Nick will tell me. Nick is about to tell me if I'm wrong.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think the way to think about this is whatever the underlying distribution of growth rates are. If you have rho of 1, whatever the initial growth rate that is chosen in the random sequence persists indefinitely. And so this is really a question of what the probability that the initial growth rate you pick is greater than 0. And so if you have really harsh environments, it'll be something much less than 50%. And if you have moderately harsh environments, it might be higher than 50%. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Yep.
So if the organism decides what kind of risks to take in the environment it's in, outside of the very obvious ones, like the organism starving, etc., how would an organism know that their phenotype is bad?
So I think that's a multi-part thing, but mechanistically, like even things like the protists I work with can certainly sense their environment. It could do things like swim up concentration gradients and things. And so if you, for instance, present them with an environment in which, like, oh, there's no food in it, or it's, so physiologically stressful,